My name is Aaron Torres, and I am a multidisciplinary artist with a focus in clothing creation and music. Growing up, what was most important is expression and an identity that I wasn't necessarily finding at like your conventional clothing stores. So I certainly had like a big fixation with thrift shopping, really embracing the individuality that you can possess through your clothes and the expression that comes with that, the liberation that comes. Ever since I was a kid, I would certainly alter my clothing or paint on it or like print out those like iron-on decals and such. It wasn't until I was probably 18 that I actually started creating clothing like from scratch. And so when I went to art school, that's when I actually learned how to sew, and I won this contest with Urban Outfitters, and that kind of like forced me to use sewing machines, really learn how to be more professional with it. Is when I realized that making clothing was like a process I enjoyed. But I mean, honestly, I always found that my different passions were going to merge or cross promote one another. I remember the first day of art school, one of my teachers was like, "Hey, so where do you see yourself in 10 years? And I was like, I want to have a production company. And I feel like right now it's like finally like taking shape. You know, I've been working as a tailor for the past 10 years. So fashion or clothing design or being a tailor, creating with clothing has been like my artistic career. Right after art school is when I became a tailor, and like my first job as a tailor, that was definitely like very validating in the sense of like, okay, I could be creative, I can use my hand and my creative abilities to basically satisfy my soul, satisfy my desires as an artist, but also generate, you know, my income and be able to survive off of that. Had always certainly been the goal. That's why I went to art school. That's why I've identified as an artist for so long. It certainly was around that time that it started to fall into place, and the work was revolving around my art. And then of course outside of work, it's like, you know, working your art, but then your art is your work. So it's like this like continuous cycle of evolving, I think, as an artist, as a business-minded person. One of my problems with art school actually is I think it should be required to teach artists to think more entrepreneurial minded or business minded. To have a business mind can only help an artist, I believe, because then that pushes you to that next level, and then suddenly you're assigning yourself deadlines and you're assigning yourself a workload that you have to be accountable and responsible for. So there's like such a negative connotation, I think, towards money or towards your art being your career or calling your work a product. But I think the more you actively embrace it, then the more real and the more artistic your whole life become. You know, I don't think money is the root of all evil, but greed certainly is. I think you can have value in yourself as an artist, charge what you're worth or sell your product for what it's worth, but also be as reasonable as humanly possible. And with my clothing being a sustainable clothing line, the responsibility as a designer is to not only sustain it environmentally, but economically and financially. And that also comes with educating people as to why, you know, my price points may not be as cheap as Walmart or fast fashion, because I don't think clothing should be undermined that way. You completely lose the value of the craft because of the industrialization of it. If anybody wants to call me a sellout to my face, I'd gladly have a conversation with them as to why I'm actually a pretty awesome person, I think. I hate working for other people. I am an awesome worker, but I'm a really horrible employee. Even though I've happened to work in my field for a decade now, the goal was always to get to the point where I had enough education, experience, and confidence to be able to work for myself. So the first time I took the leap of faith was when I was living in Austin. That was 4 years ago that I quit all my jobs as a tailor, or I worked as a production sewer for my friend and an assistant designer for another friend. It just got to the point where I put myself out there to accept freelance work, and that started outweighing my time that I had to focus on my job. You feel it as an artist when you realize that there's never going to be a perfect time to take that leap, and that's why it's a leap of faith. With it, you know, comes a lot of fear and uncertainty, but with it comes this fire that you have to create because you are dependent upon yourself at that point. Yeah, it forces you to deliver, to produce. That's what I always knew I wanted. Like my life to be my art, my art to be my life. Working for myself suddenly opens me up to being a costume designer for music videos, or a teaching artist at the museum, or somebody that could help prototype someone else's design ideas, or somebody that simply wants custom clothes made, or gives me time to work on my clothing brands. It definitely opens up the possibilities and what your focus and what your niche can be. And you tend to attract like-minded people. You tend to attract people you want to work with. Then you develop this network of people from all different walks of life. I've noticed that like my clients all tend to be this like really positive, driven, ambitious people, and that's exactly the type of people that I want to attract. The beautiful thing about clothing design or fashion as art, I think, is it has such a subconscious effect on people. It's like a spell, like that's when I learned that art, it very much is a spell, and we're all wizards. Part of the lore of designing clothing, I think, is leaving an impression on people, bringing some kind of joy or bringing some kind of happiness into people's life. So that was certainly like a very transcendental piece, that with clothes it was like, all right, it's way more important than just a shirt or just pants or just something that clothes our naked body. I think what's interesting now is that we have like those Facebook memories, and depending on how long you've been on Facebook, it could backtrack quite a bit, and thinking like, man, like so much changes in life in terms of what you're experiencing, but in terms of like our person, like we're still so very the same. Memories of like events that I threw years ago, or projects I was a part of. And it's kind of nice to like remind myself like, okay, I've been actively creating and putting myself out there as an artist for well over a decade. We never stop evolving, we never stop growing. I would hope to never stay the same, at least. So music definitely inspires me. That said, 60s culture and hippie culture, 70s culture inspires me a lot. Jazz era culture, Great Depression era architecture in New Orleans really inspires me, and El Paso inspires me because of that. The architecture here, the beauty of it. When I see really beautiful buildings, like I see the human body almost as like a building. I used to consider myself, or call myself, like my title as a clothing architect, and I guess I still consider myself that way, because a designer, you can design something, but if you're not actually creating it and building it, that word kind of cheapens it a little bit. So I've never really like identified with the term like clothing designer or fashion designer, but hands-on forms of old world art definitely inspires me. Like I love like metal forging and blacksmithing, and I think other artists in general, most of my friends and my community are all centered around different forms of art and music. I mean, I just get so inspired by my friends constantly. Ever since I was a child, I was very attracted to like pop art, so obviously Andy Warhol has been a big influence in my life, even though there's a moment where I went through like a very love-hate relationship with him. Early that I had beef with, or that, later Warhol I kind of had beef with, and I think that just goes down to like my Puritan, like creative, like I want to create, but then it also, from him I have learned as an artist, like it doesn't cheapen your art to think about the intellectual property behind it and like how you can delegate work, and that's just like such an interesting area to me. Of course, part of me feels like disgusted by that, but then other parts are like, all right, that's cool. Like I think part of our duty as people is to educate. I do my best to teach workshops at the museum, or I've done them here at Fab Lab. Just collaborate with people and teach what you know. It's almost like there's no better time than now to really consider what goes into your work and how it affects the planet, how it affects people. I think that's reason enough to want to inspire other people to do good, spread kindness and innovation. I mean, there's such a fine line as an artist of keeping your artistic integrity, but also advancing your career and advancing, taking advantage of opportunities. It's almost like at this time where I honestly feel this shift where people feel like they can't afford to Netflix and chill because Donald Trump is our president right now, and a lot of scary things are happening in the world with the environment, with politics. I read this awesome article the other day of how like Taylor Swift needs to take a seat from 2017 because there's no time for like petty self-absorbed art right now. I think there's a lot to that sentiment of people being more attracted to stability and to sustainability and how we can advance, how humanity can advance, because we're all on the same rock together, really. I studied classical voice for many years, and one of the things that my teacher always said was, as a singer, you're chipping away. It's like being a sculptor, and you're chipping away pieces that aren't you. The perfect genre is genreless. I'm inspired by many different things. I don't like to put myself in a box. One thing I often hear about my clothes is that it looks really worldly. It looks like it's from this culture or that culture, or I could do good here, I do good there, and that means a lot to me because outside of the conversation of like cultural appropriation or something, which I think is like way overblown, but like still like obviously a valid discussion to have right now. I think to be able to like take essences of different cultures, not because you're trying to steal from it, but because it means something to you, or because being a person of the world, a person of humanity, sometimes that essence is in you and you realize there's other people and there's other tribes out there that think like you. And I think the more we allow ourselves to create, the more we allow ourselves to do things without a filter, the purer it becomes, regardless of how people see it or want to dissect it or want to define it. Because everybody wants to define everything. Everybody wants to understand. Everybody wants to connect. That's human nature. I think it's sometimes hard to come to terms with or to rationalize that we're not going to understand everything, and some things are just by chance. That's the interesting thing about people's aesthetic. It's like, where does aesthetic come from? The part of that's something you're born with, I think. Have you ever tried open eye meditating? Like, that's literally what we're doing right now, except for words are involved. But it's like it's a form of meditation where basically you meditate with somebody. It's awesome because you get to share that experience with that person and kind of share the energy. In my early 20s is when I really started to seek out meditation and yoga and different forms of consciousness. So like psychedelia is obviously very important to me in my clothing. I think it's very evident that I like colorful, geometric, trippy things, and that certainly started from experimenting with psychedelics in high school. At that point is also how I started to develop my sense of spirit and my connection with nature. Depression is something that I've dealt with my entire life. With depression, it's like, well, you could take pills and those will help ease the symptoms, but it's not going to cure depression. It's going to be something you deal with your entire life if you suffer from depression. Researching that and living with it and wanting to learn everything that I can about how I can stabilize my mind and my spirit is kind of how like I actively developed the inspiration to want to get into meditation and want to get into yoga and want to get into different forms of breath work or consciousness, basically, because it really helps keep me sane. I think that's why I really like polling, because it's kind of like this mind, body, soul fusion of defying gravity and pushing your body, but also putting yourself in physically uncomfortable positions and circumstances that kind of force you to go into that meditative state. I mean, it's literally changed my life. Like, it was this thing that I was like, oh man, it just has like all these elements of things that I love naturally that I hadn't necessarily found like an outlet to express in a more like physically athletic sense or mindful sense or spiritual sense. It was like, okay, the pull. Sweet. I'll roll with it. I'll pull with it. In terms of networking, I think what's really important is to not fear putting yourself out there. To really embrace whoring yourself out, for lack of better terms. You can't feel like you're a self-absorbed evil person because you're posting on Facebook photos of your work and you're asking people to spread the word. You can't feel any kind of negativity about that. And I feel like so many of us kind of, for whatever reason, innately do. We're kind of taught by society to not praise ourselves or to not seem confident or to not be cocky. And I think when I was telling you about making the leap of faith, for example, so much of that was just developing the confidence in myself to be able to say, okay, I am this title, I am this clothing architect or this designer or whatever, that people can trust it. I think once you accept that and embrace that, then suddenly this idea of networking and this idea of spreading the word about your work just becomes second nature, because obviously you want to connect with people. And so I know it could seem daunting to a lot of people to feel like, well, I'm just another nameless face in the crowd wanting this or doing that. But I think focusing on your niche and who you are as a person. You know, the reason why the Doors are awesome, or Jim Morrison, in my opinion, is awesome, isn't because Jim Morrison's the best singer. Jim Morrison is the best at being Jim Morrison. The Doors are great at being the Doors. And when you kind of like apply that to your art, then you realize like, okay, obviously I need to continuously push myself technically as an artist. Whatever essence it is that makes you you, that's what you need to really focus on, and that's what's going to connect you with people, because people want an authentic experience. As a creative, you're basically offering them a platform to have a product that they can't make themselves. So how are you going to be that person that facilitates that product, but also facilitates an enjoyable experience in that as well? So don't be afraid. Whore yourself out. Be your own pimp. It's worth it. I'm a circus freak unicorn, and I've had to accept it.